From First Paw Media, sponsored by Dream Chaser Leadership in Anchorage, Alaska. This is the Peak Experience Podcast. Here we talk about leadership, team building, strategic management, and organizational development. Visit our website, peakexp.org. Now, here are your hosts, Robert and Michelle Forto.
Hello and welcome, everybody. This is Robert from the Peak Experience Podcast, and I'm joined by my co-host today. Her name is Dr. Latoya Skinner. She is calling in from North Carolina here in the United States. Latoya, how's it going today?
Everything is going great at a winter level. How are you?
Everything is going well here in Alaska. I know it's a stark difference in terms of weather, but here we are at the time of recording, fresh into 2025. And I want to ask you one thing before we jump into this. Are you a person that has New Year's resolutions?
You know, I used to make resolutions, and then I feel bad when I didn't accomplish those or reach those resolutions or stick with them. And so now I just kind of create goals that are attainable, and I feel a little better about myself.
I'm the same way, and we are a dog training company up here as well, and we always find our clients, they make all these goals and plans for their dogs, and of course, by the end of January, just like with us, they quit doing the training, and just like the gyms for people to work out, they're usually empty by the end of January. So what is a big goal that you have for 2025?
I think a big goal for myself for 2025 is to focus on branding my individual business and focusing a lot more on that so that I can increase my clientele. I have some wonderful clients now that I consult for, and I want to keep them, but I also want to expand my portfolio.
I like it, and I think you're doing that a little bit with the podcast. I know you jumped into the deep end on this. I think this is probably your 7th or 8th episode now. I know I had you on as a guest before, and like you, I have a goal to really scale our business. And what's very interesting, I'm sure you would agree with this, Latoya, is since we finished this dang doctorate program, we have a little bit of extra time on our hands, don't we?
Oh my goodness, yes. I sometimes sit at my desk in the evening and I think about what is it that I'm supposed to be doing, and it's nothing because I don't have any more schoolwork or homework to focus on or any research to do, and so it feels a little weird. It's taking some getting used to for sure.
For sure, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today when we talk about the literature review. This is a cornerstone piece of not only a doctorate project like Latoya and I took part in, but any dissertation or any academic writing or the such. And we are setting this up. We have 6 questions. And if you've been a fan of the podcast and listened in the last few episodes, you know that we sort of break this down and go piece by piece. So I will answer a question, then Latoya will go, and we'll just go back and forth, and hopefully provide you guys some real insight. Okay, so the first question is, what are the key components of a thorough literature review, and how can researchers ensure that they cover all relevant aspects? And I'm going to go ahead and answer this one first. And I think you will have very much the same take on this as I do. But the first overarching thing is to define your research questions by acquiring appropriate literature from appropriate databases, evaluating the source's credibility, identifying key themes, and critically analyzing methodology and findings from previous studies. So before you answer that, Latoya, let me break that down just a little bit. So I think a lot of people get confused on this, and they think that they have to go out and find every piece of literature that there is on a topic and really try to distill that, dive deep into it, and break it down and figure out how it fits into their study. But that's an almost impossible task. And I would like you to address that as well. So what do you think? What are the key components of a strong literature review in your opinion?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for starters, for myself, my personal experience with it, developing the components was realizing and identifying what I wanted in my paper and taking those sections and breaking them down with your introduction, your conclusions, the meat of your work, as well as your references. And so for me, that is your key component, because you're developing your paper off of the literature that already exists, but also the new information that you find out through your individual research. And so for me, I think those are really key and helpful through the process.
Yeah, and like you said, once you figure out what the meat of your topic is, then you can kind of break that down into pieces. And we're going to talk about that in a second. But both you and I studied leadership. So a leadership question or a leadership problem. And as many know, there are leadership examples that go back a couple of hundred years, at least here in the United States. And we cannot dive into those very, very old, if you will, topics, say a leadership question from the 1930s or the 1940s. Now, that can provide some background or some historical analysis to it, but we cannot rely on that literature for today's topics, can we?
Yeah, that's a great point to point out, because that's one of the hit or miss things that I experienced in my research. I would find something that was really, really interesting, really, really good and captivating, and looked at the date and could not use it because, as we know, with Liberty, there was the 5-year rule. And so you have to make sure that it's something that is relevant, because things change. Leadership practices have changed, as well as theories. And so being relevant is also something else to make sure that you stick with. And so you can't use something from a long time ago. It's not because it's not relevant, it's just not helpful right now.
There you go. So question number 2, and I'll go first on this one as well. How do you determine the scope of your literature review, and what strategies can help narrow down your focus to the most pertinent studies? And I like to tell people, Latoya, that it's almost like a recipe. You're developing this marvelous dish for Sunday dinner or Thanksgiving or whatever. You know exactly what you want it to look like in the presentation at the table, but there are all sorts of pieces that have to go into that. You got to, like on Thanksgiving, you have to have your turkey and your ham and your sweet potatoes and all of that. But there's also ingredients that make that turkey taste good, whether it's the brine or the cooking method or whatever. And I think that's sort of like the scope of a good literature review, finding those pieces, those recipe items, if you will, to go in and develop this ideal of what you want it to look like in the end. Do you have an analogy like that?
Yeah, I do. I think also, focusing on your framework and your methodology is also quite helpful. And to your point, just making sure that all of the key pieces, because if you take a recipe and you're missing something, you're going to know that you're missing it, because it's not going to taste the same. And so making sure that you have all the pieces is going to be essential to your literature review.
So with that, the second part of that question was strategies to help you narrow down that focus. What did you use? Did you go to a particular database? Did you use the school library? Did you use Google Scholar? How did you start this? So here you have this topic, and let's say that it's a leadership question about what was yours about? Your leadership question?
My leadership question or topic?
Your topic, yes.
Oh, okay. My topic was understanding the interruption of poor communication between leaders and employees in nonprofit organizations.
Okay, so you have this topic, this communication topic in regard to leadership. What strategies did you use to start to narrow that down? Because communication and leadership obviously are huge topics, and there's probably thousands upon thousands of academic papers on both of those.
Absolutely. I would say 90% of my work came from the Liberty, the Falwell Library at Liberty, and the other sources came from sources like Google Scholar that were credible, because that's another thing, is making sure that wherever you're referencing from, that is a credible source. There is a lot of literature out, but it doesn't mean that all of it is credible or to your school's requirements or meeting your school's requirements. And so for me, those strategies included my research questions, making sure that they were clear and that I myself understood what it was that I was trying to research and understand. So making sure that those are clearly defined, I think is something that is good. And like I said, credible resources. The school library, you cannot go wrong because they're putting that information there for you to look up until you know for sure that it is definitely credible. I'd also say that looking into medical journals, if you're doing medical studies, you know, even though it's specific for medical, leadership can come from any source. And even though I did mine on nonprofit, there were a couple medical studies that were very helpful to me from the perspective of a leader in the organization.
And one follow-up question to that, and you brought up a very good point about cross-discipline studies with medical literature and leadership and all of that. Did you ever go down the rabbit hole of finding an idea and then just sort of following it down and ending up in a place where, oh my goodness, I cannot believe this took me here? And I say that because what ended up happening with me is I found very quickly, you talked about medical, I found very quickly that a lot of my literature was in China and Turkey and India and places that probably have different leadership ideologies than we have here in America. Did you find yourself doing something very similar? Maybe not country, but a different type of ideal?
Absolutely. It's funny that you mentioned that because a lot of times I would open an article or a journal or a piece of literature and I would look at it, I would read it, it would be something, usually the topic is what would engage me to begin with. And so, and you know, sometimes you can have those keywords that you can put in and you populate all of these different resources. And so for me, I definitely went down that rabbit hole, as you stated. And sometimes it was interesting, intriguing, and it led me somewhere. And then other times I would say, gosh, I read all this and there's nothing that I can really take from it. But there were quite a few, to your point, from other countries that were really interesting for me in using the library with Liberty, because a lot of them were from overseas countries, specifically, as you mentioned, with China. And there was a lot that I wasn't prepared for when it came to the leadership subject from the country of China, just because I was thinking that when I populated something, it would come from the United States. And to my surprise, most of the time it came from other countries.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with that because we are all human. And of course, we tend to think in the same way. It may not be the same ideology, but at least in terms of leadership, there's usually some type of definitive structure, whether it be hierarchical or participatory or agency or whatever. Those topics are pretty similar, and you can kind of distill those down as you're going for sure. So question number 3, and I think this is where a lot of people struggle because we see it in our Facebook groups and the back and forth that we have with our fellow students, and that is, what are some effective methods for organizing and synthesizing information gathered for a literature review? So I will go first on this one as well, Latoya. One of the first things I did, and I know we've talked about this in our previous episodes, is I started from the very first classes to start writing about the topic that I had an interest in. So I did not write about, for example, you said communication. I don't think I ever wrote about communication in terms of leadership in any of those early papers unless we were required to do so. I always tried to hone in on doing so. And one of the things I found, a couple of key takeaways here, is I used Google Scholar for almost all of my research, all of my database analysis and all of that. And what I did first off is I developed a folder in Google Scholar for every topic or every class. These are the core classes in our program. And then I did subfolders for every leadership issue or question in that particular class. So like I said, if we were doing agency theory or participation theory or hierarchical issues or whatever, I would break those down. But the key component I did, something that saved my bacon more than once, is I developed a Word doc, very simple Word doc, for every source that I had, and then I did a very rudimentary annotated bibliography for each one of those. And we're going to talk about why that's important in just a second. But the key takeaway there is if you use a Google Doc or anything similar, it can use keywords. So if you're talking about, in my case, succession planning or female leadership or any of those things, you can do a very quick search of your annotated bibliography and we'll pull up all those relevant sources to use that come up with those keywords. And so I had this huge doc. It was probably a couple of hundred pages long of all of the sources that I had. And then I had these subfolders on Google Scholar, and I always made sure that that was up to date. And another quick takeaway here is if you are using Google Scholar, make sure that you log in using your school ID, your email typically, and it will connect directly to your school database. And Latoya said that she used that primarily. So I was seeing the same things that Latoya was seeing, but I was also seeing all the other databases as well. And we'll talk about access in just a second after Latoya talks about how she organized her materials for her literature review.
I am just so impressed with the way that you organize yourself with your information when you mentioned about your folders. And if I had known any of that before I started, I probably would have been a better student in the program. I am very much a fly by the seat of my pants person, and I save myself every time when it comes to organization. I think the thing that helped me was a citation generator, which I was able to put all of my my resources in and create a citation from it. But it also allowed me to create a Word document from it. And so to your point about being able to put in those keywords, it was very helpful in that aspect. But I never thought about in the beginning of the program, making sure that I paid attention, because if you recall, it was later in the program when I started developing an interest in what I really wanted my topic to be. So I'm very impressed that you were able to do that early in the game. For me, the citation generator was really helpful because I was able to create that Word document, and that really saved me a lot of time, actually.
So with that point, the citation generator, let's talk a little bit about tools and then let's talk about access. So did you use any other tools that you can recall in developing not only your literature review, but for any other parts of this? Did you use things like Grammarly or anything like that to help you out down the line?
Absolutely. Grammarly was very helpful to me. And I think I was introduced to Grammarly in one of the social media sites that we have as students, but also the APA book was very helpful. But I think Grammarly was more helpful than the APA book. I enjoy the APA book. I found it to be very helpful, but at times I also became kind of confused because it updated a couple of times while we were in school. I know for me in the program, I think I received 2 copies of it. And so I like Grammarly much better. It was, user-friendly. I was able to pull it up on the computer and it caught the things that I needed to improve in the paper.
Yeah, I used Grammarly a heck of a lot in my program, and we could go down a rabbit hole with that and AI and all of that as well. But I never had any issues with Grammarly. I think it's an excellent product. I used the plugin on Google Chrome, and it allowed me to, cross-reference and all of that, and that worked out very well. Did you write your paper in Microsoft Word? Did you use Google Docs? What did you use to put down the words on paper, or technical paper, if you will?
So I use OneDrive, which is the Microsoft version of Google Docs. So I use that because it helped me save a lot of time. It took me initially I did not use that, and so it wasn't automatically saving my work. That was a lesson learned, huge lesson learned. But once I caught on, I started using OneDrive in order to automatically update my work and, save it from version to version. And so that was very helpful to me, especially with changes being made.
Yeah, and on that, I used Dropbox primarily for my organization, and the reason I did that for a couple of reasons, like I talked about with Google Scholar, I broke everything down by folders. But one of the things I did on Dropbox, and this is kind of rudimentary in terms of data collection, but I put every course in its own folder. So I did a course for 714 and 720 and 785 and all of that. And then when I got into the project, one of the things that I would do is inside of each folder, I would have each task. And then in each task, I would have whether it's approved or a revision or something like that. So I had those tiered folders that I could easily bring up. So if I had an issue with, task 3, edit number 1, I could go back very quickly and not have to search all over the drive. I knew exactly where task 3, edit 1 was. So if there was a question or a revision I had to make, it was so simple to be able to do that. And then I sort of moved forward. So let's talk a little bit about access. And I think this is a real sticking point for a lot of people. We talked about having your Google Scholar attached to your school ID or your email, so it pulls in those access points to the different journals. But there's also ways to go about doing that that is not so easy. Did you ever find yourself where you found the perfect article for whatever topic you were searching, and then you click that button, it says, nope, you don't have access, you got to pay for it, the $39 a month or whatever? Did you struggle with that at all?
Oh my goodness, yes, that was the death of my demise. I ran into that, encountered that so many times. It's a laughing matter now, but when you're in the middle of stressing out and trying to get this stuff done, it is annoying, to say the least, and it holds you back, and it's time consuming because then you have to kind of start over and find another article. But yeah, I have experienced that, and it is not a pleasant experience.
My biggest struggle with that, Latoya, was the biblical articles, the biblical research part of that, because if it was not in the Liberty Library database, so if they did not have access to that particular journal, that's where I really struggled, because it's such a niche topic. And of course, most institutions, at least here in the United States, are not Christian organizations, so they don't partake into databases for biblical research. That's where I really struggled. Did you struggle there as well?
Absolutely. That's exactly where I got stuck and struggled. I think it was like several ProQuest articles that I tried to open that weren't opening for me. And so it was almost a little headache. And, you have to, again, like I said, start over. But that's exactly where I got stuck. And I was thinking initially I thought I did something incorrectly. And then I realized that it wasn't just me.
So next question we have, and this is a key point. We talked a little bit about those annotated bibliographies. I think a lot of people really struggle with those. And that is, how can researchers critically evaluate the quality and credibility of the sources that they include in their literature review? And I know that you are very familiar with doing annotated bibliographies and the pieces that have to come into that to make that effective. Some of the tools that I used, or at least the criteria I used number one, what was the topic of the paper? What was the population or sample? What was the methodology? What was the location of that? How recent of a study was it? And what was the outcome or perceived benefits or struggles? So I sort of broke it down into every one of those pieces. And then I sort of distilled all of those sources down to see if they met that criteria. And as I was ticking those things off, each one of those points, if you will, that's how I determined if it was a credible or a reliable article. For example, if they had a study of 3 people, that wasn't necessarily a robust enough study for what I was looking for. What did you use in terms of defining credibility or reliability for a piece of literature?
Yeah, I think making sure that public perception is everything. And so making sure that the reputation of the sources that you're using is really good, and then how relevant they are to your research topic, and how current or recent the information is. Again, we talked about in the beginning of the call, just making sure that information is relevant in today's time, not from many, many moons ago. And then also making sure that the things that you're researching are evidence-based, that they have some weight behind them, and that they're, as you said, credible. I think for me, those were the things that I was looking for. I could look at an article and, as you said, looking at who the authors were, how many authors there were. I've seen journals and articles that I came across that had a plethora of people behind them, but there was also so much information that they provided to the article. It was so meaty, and it provided such good information. But I also ran across some that didn't have as much, and they were very vague articles. And I just thought, from my standpoint, wow, I wonder what they could have came up with if they had, became allies with somebody and worked with somebody else on this, because their beginning is good, but the article doesn't really have any substance to it.
Yeah, and that's a key point. I think a lot of people early on, as researchers or as doctoral fellows or whatever, they try to find people that have some backing, some skin in the game, and that's key in any business. That's your network that you're building.
Mm-hmm.
But they have this credibility behind them, whether it be, in our case, our research chair and our admin reviewers and all that. That was sort of our team. But then once they get there, they quickly find out that a lot of times is just like in other ways in life, the people that are part of these projects, you know as well as I do, when you go into a group project in any stretch, there's always people in those groups that don't want to pull their weight. I'm sure you would agree.
Oh my goodness, we've all been there.
Okay, so here we are. Question number 5: common pitfalls that doctorate candidates should avoid when conducting their literature review. And I will go first. And I know we've talked a little bit about this. One of my biggest pitfalls, or oh my goodness moments, was in my first doctorate course, the project course 887, is when we did the literature review, and I lost the entire thing. I was working on it on Word. I had it pulled up one night, typing away on the article, and I did not save the article. And I woke up the next morning and it said Word needs to do an auto update. And I did an update, and somehow or another it corrupted my Word program. So everything that I wrote up to that point was just a jumble of nonsensical text. So thinking about, just 1,000 symbols of text were on my article. And it was one of those moments where I thought, oh my goodness, I'm ready to throw in the towel. I'm ready to quit. So a common pitfall for me is, in terms of tip, is do not update your Word or any other program when you have the document open. Definitely save it first before you click that bar at the top. I think that will help you immensely and cause you a heck of a lot of headache and heartache as they're going. Another pitfall that I found, at least in our program, is the word requirement. I think so many, not word, but page requirement. I think so many people hang their hat, Latoya, on a page requirement. So they say, okay, you have to have a 30-page lit review, so on and so forth. And then they write for the page count. And they say, okay, well, I'm at page 30, but, I've only got 3/4 of the literature that I need done. And they just, they hang it up. They say, okay, I've got page count, I'm done. What do you think about that? And do you think that that's a pitfall that a lot of students get involved in?
Yeah, I think one pitfall, as I mentioned earlier about myself, is just knowing how poorly organized I was during this whole process. Just in retrospect and reflection in conversation with you, um, poor organization, can definitely set you back. And so making sure that you're organized and your paper is organized, I think, is a reflection of everything. And then making sure that the way that you're selecting your sources is appropriate and helpful to your work. I did not cry during this process until we got to the literature review. And that is when, in one semester, my literature review had gone through admin review and been accepted. And then the following semester, it was rejected by a new admin. And talk about defeating. I was at the same point where this is where I wanted to give up in the process, because I just thought to myself, I am redoing work that I've already done and it was already accepted, but there were pieces that I needed to hone in on, and they weren't correct. And so that is why the new admin wanted me to go back and refocus on that area. And it took me a good while because I had some personal things going on. So it really took me a full semester to go back and recorrect those things. And that is definitely when I got defeated and I didn't want to continue with the process.
That's such a good point. And I think a lot of students, especially in our program at Liberty, are shaking their heads or nodding their heads, if you will, at exactly what you said. Do you think, Latoya, that they're doing that on purpose, that they're saying, okay, well, it may have been approved by admin reviewer number 1, but I'm admin reviewer number 2, and I'm going to deny it? Do you think that that's sort of a trial by fire, or a learning process, or a way to get to see if students are really committed? Or do you think that there's an other motive? It could not, maybe it's positive, maybe it's a negative, but do you think that that's sort of a weeding out process for this, or do you think it's by design?
I think it could be a little bit of both, just from the pessimistic and optimistic side. I definitely think it could go either way. I think that the discouragement and discouraging part of it is when it's kicked back from the admins with very little context around why it's being kicked back. Particularly for me, what was most frustrating, and this is a transparent moment, what was frustrating to me mostly was because I had already gone through the previous semester, the work had already been accepted. And so I'm moving on and expecting to move along in my task and in the process in the next semester. And again, this is after Christmas break. So we've lost like several weeks of time where I haven't had much communication with anyone. And so coming back into that was definitely disheartening. And as I mentioned, very frustrating, because I felt like if there was something majorly wrong with the document that I presented, it would not have gone through admin review the first time. But also that revealed some internal challenges with the school and the department amongst the admins. And I think that there was some work that they needed to work on internally that had nothing to do with students.
Yeah, I agree with that. And you and I saw a lot of those same struggles because we started so close together. And I know people that are just finishing up now, when we look in particular on the Facebook group, a lot of those same students in our cohort went through the same thing. And I think that is a learning experience, not only for the students, but also for the administration and the chairs and all of that. It's just sort of a way of developing a program. And we're sort of the early guinea pigs to this program. We were some of the first ones that got through the process. And I think that is sort of paving the way for the future students in our program in particular. So last question here. I'm going to have you go first on this one. And that is, how do you integrate gaps in the existing literature in your own research questions? What did you do to deal with that?
Yeah, so I think looking at new insights about what may be a potential gap or identifying gaps. I think for me, identifying the gaps was a little easier because I had firsthand information and experience from personal work and experiences that related to this topic, which was also why I selected it. And so being able to identify those gaps for me was very helpful. And so when it came to the literature, there wasn't a lot of literature specifically on my topic. So I really had to dig deep, which in itself is a gap. And so by me having to really look at how my paper was set up and the different components with the theories and the methodologies around it, showed me that there was a gap and just, very little literature that was available to me on the front side of things. And so me having to really dig deep, I had to think about it from a different perspective. Like I had to dive deep into communication, leadership theories, things like that just simply weren't available from regular research, I would say, without having to explore and be a little creative in how I was completing my research and the literature review.
Yeah, I had a couple of the same issues that you had. First off was the amount of literature on the particular topic. I pigeonholed myself or niched down a little bit too much by having service industry in Alaska with an emerging female leader. Those were very specific questions, and there was a huge gap there. Because at least in that topic, even today in 2024, 2025, there are still very few companies that do a succession plan from the parents, if you will, down to the daughter. It's still very male-centric in terms of succession. So that was a huge gap. One of my biggest gaps, and I know we've talked about that in previous episodes, was the COVID pandemic, where pretty much all research stopped for a long time, especially here in the United States. And I think that's why we saw so much research coming from other countries, like we mentioned, China and India and Turkey and so on. Those guys were still doing research in terms of business leadership, where they weren't so much here in the United States. So that provided a huge gap. And then lastly, in terms of leadership often happens in cycles, and cycles are sort of outlined by where we are as a society. So if you think about leadership in the 1960s and 1970s, it was an entirely different ideal of what leadership looked like back then to compared now. Bosses were different than they are now. Employees were looked on as different than they are now. There was a lot less agency and back and forth between leadership and subordinates, or whatever you want to call them. So that provided a big gap as well. And I'm sure that you saw those same things when you were diving into the communication, right?
Absolutely. Just the work world, as we call it, has definitely changed. And so leadership has changed more so than what it used to be a long time ago. And to your point with your research topic, women really weren't leaders back then.
Yep.
At least, it took a long time for women to be recognized as leaders in the workplace. And so typically there's just always been men in the workplace that have been leading and in positions of authority or leadership.
Well, there you have it, guys. We could definitely talk on and on about literature reviews. We just barely touched on what makes an effective literature review, but there's still so much more to learn. I learn every time that I look into this topic, and I'm sure you do as well. Latoya, before we go today, where can folks find out more about you? You talked a little bit about your business. Are you active on any social media? Do you have a website or what?
Yes, I am on social media on Facebook as my name, and I can also be reached at my email address, which is lskinner, 5, at liberty.edu. I'm working on my branding, and so I'm hoping to get my website launched sometime this spring, as well as some promotional materials so that I can share with everyone.
There you go. And you can find me by just searching my name, Robert Forto, Forto, on any social media. I'm probably most active on Facebook, I guess, and on LinkedIn. So I sort of separate professional stuff on LinkedIn and more personal stuff over on Facebook. So if you like what you hear, definitely check out our library that Latoya and I have done. We've done 4 or 5 episodes here leading up on a doctorate project, and we have a whole bunch of episodes where we do interviews as well. So make sure you follow the Peak Experience podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And until next time, goodbye.
From First Paw Media, this is the Peak Experience Podcast. We hope you enjoyed this podcast, and we invite you to subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You will find a link in our episode notes. You can tap or swipe on the episode cover art, and you'll see some offers from our sponsors. You can support our show by supporting them. If you like what you have heard, we would love it if you would give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends how to subscribe too.